next one is, I hate to use the word unprecedented because it's a bit overused at the moment, but we have seen unprecedented levels of monetary policy easing and obviously fiscal spending around the globe in different variants in different countries. But one thing that worries us a little bit perhaps is the potential impacts, on something like inflation down the track with all this input into the economy. Could that result in some inflationary pressure?
Well, first of all, I'd say, Rod, is what we're seeing by the central banks and the major governments in the world is a necessary evil here. Without the actions that have been taken, we faced a very real risk of a depression. So, I don't think they've had a lot of choice here, but of course there are second order consequences of doing things like they're doing at the moment. I would say not doing it has far more serious consequences. What are some of the implications of what the central banks and governments are doing? I think first of all is they're reducing moral hazard in the marketplace. Businesses that should have failed and the losses should have gone onto the credit and debt providers, they're being protected. And in a normal economic downturn, capitalism should have reallocated those resources, and we may well go through a period where those resources don't get efficiently reallocated because the government's sitting there and the central banks are sitting there and kicking the can down the road for some failing business enterprises. I think that's collateral damage for doing the right thing. Your question on inflation is a very interesting question, and one in which we've debated with both Janet Yellen and Kevin Walsh, who are consultant. Kevin was a former Federal Reserve member. Of course, Janet was a former chair of the Federal Reserve. Both of them don't believe we're facing an inflation issue in the short term. And when you think about inflation, there are two fundamental drivers of inflation in the world. The first, I call it supply and demand. So if you could get a period of very constrained supply like we had in the 1970s with OPEC, with the oil price shock, when you reduce supply of oil below natural demand, you could get rapidly escalating prices. Or if you have a massive demand shock or a massive excess demand in the economy, you've got a really hot economy, both those things could create inflation. And the opposite, that if you've got excess supply in the world and you've got aggregate demand that's very subdued, you'll get very low or disinflation in the world. I would argue, and our consultants would argue to you, that what we're likely to see in the period of ahead is a supply excess and a demand deficit. And that means we're probably going to get low inflation for the next period ahead. The other side of inflation that can get caused, and you're right, is by the printing of money.
Just following on from that too, there's been some talk in the marketplace around countries perhaps looking to future onshoring as a result of COVID-19. Is that something that you would entertain, Hamish?
I think it's easy to say and very difficult to do. I think in very strategic industries like maybe healthcare supplies or in defence industries, yes, you could have dictated by governments that it's in their interest, even if it's more expensive, to have strategic manufacturing onshore. I do think what this is exposed is the just-in-time manufacturing process that ended up having no inventories in the system. Literally, they left the factory, went onto a ship, and then ended up in warehouses and straight into store with very, very short lead times on that. When you have a pandemic like this and the supply gets shut down, the factories get shut, suddenly we find there's no inventories in the system. I suspect they will address that by lengthening the supply chains and actually putting more warehouses, not moving the manufacturing, but putting more warehouses around the world and putting more stock that can cope with a month or 2 months or whatever they determine is appropriate, that if manufacturing got shut down for a period, they could keep operating and having those warehouses in the right place in the world. And that has a cost to business. But if you think it's going to be a situation where businesses themselves will make a choice that they're going to onshore all their manufacturing, if that manufacturing is more expensive than their competitors can access somewhere else, that business is going to be at a competitive disadvantage. And that's the nature of capitalism. And even if a country like the United States suddenly dictated everything was going to be manufactured in America, many of these businesses still operate as multinationals. So suddenly the German manufacturer, who's part of their supply chain for parts in China, could be at a distinct cost advantage over the US business, where the government has dictated that all its manufacturing must be outside of China or in the United States. So I think in the end, economics will trump outside those strategic industries. I think we'll get a lengthening of supply chain, but this whole sort of call that we're suddenly going to get a massive shift of all manufacturing out of China and back into the United States, I personally think that's very unlikely outside some very strategic industries like healthcare.
Yeah, and I guess we've seen that in the past, haven't we, Hamish? Reactions to markets, it can sometimes create a little bit of noise, but the reality sets in Economics 101 where the lowest price dictates, doesn't it?
I think economics wins in the end.